Innovation in sustainable development is more pressing than ever. At the moment of recording this video, Los Angeles is being torched with a massive fire that has put more than 150K of its residents under an order of evacuation. The death toll and the suffering of people should remind us of the importance of designing tools and innovating solutions that help us manage the resources. For that reason, I've decided to invite Dr. Gordon McCord. He's a scholar associated with the University of California, San Diego, and he directs its Center of Global Policy and Strategy. Dr. McCord has a proven trajectory helping governments across the globe to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 and connecting environmental data to understand the complex relationships between environment, economy, and people's behaviors. In this conversation, you will find two parts. The first part, I ask about the current situation of the Sustainable Development Goals and what the current environment means at the moment for innovating or creating solutions in any of its dimensions. In the second part, I ask about a very special type of data, geospatial data, and how this geospatial data has been important for Dr. Gordon McCord to generate solutions in different latitudes and in different continents. I hope this conversation motivates you to innovate, creating solutions that matter to millions. And please subscribe and send me your comments. See you around. In 2015, world leaders adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, a set of interconnected indicators for a more sustainable future, understanding that sustainability is caring about the resources for future generations. Although progress to accomplish these goals is still a challenge, and political consensus is more difficult regarding the current priorities. Geopolitical conflicts, economic instability makes this challenge of transforming our economies into a more sustainable future more challenging. For that reason, I have invited a wonderful guest, Professor Gordon McCord. He has developed multiple tools for governments across the world.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. I would like to start by asking you the following. The Sustainable Development Goals lay an ambitious roadmap for global progress. From your perspective, what is the most urgent challenge that needs innovative solutions to achieve these goals, particularly in the context of food systems and land use?
Sure. Thanks for the question. What's great about the Sustainable Development Goals, despite some shortcomings mentioned in the intro, is that they embrace the idea that the challenges society faces are complex and interconnected. The power of the SDGs is that they include the idea of poverty reduction, as well as social inclusion, as well as environmental sustainability. And really, at the heart of it, regardless of what country you're in, regardless of the political alignment of the government, nobody disagrees with the core premise of humanity and every country wanting and needing these things. Whether you like the labeling that the UN gives to this framework, objectives are indisputable, and that's their power. At the same time, I think the spirit of them is that you have to take a holistic approach to thinking about all of these challenges. I hesitate a bit when I get asked about prioritizing among them, because the whole point is not to prioritize. You can't have social inclusion without environmental sustainability. You can't have poverty reduction without social inclusion. The right approach is a very data-driven one. These are quantitative goals by 2030 that we've all agreed upon as UN member states. And we should take them seriously and reverse engineer a path to accomplishing them. And the gaps which will come out in each location will be different. Different countries and different regions of different countries will be on track or off track for different parts of the SDG indicator framework. And that lets us target public policy and target private and public resources to trying to close those gaps. The priorities will be different in every place, depending on how the place is doing vis-a-vis the different elements inside the SDG targets. With regards to land use specifically and food systems, This is a global emergency. We are overshooting across all of the dimensions relevant for land use. First, on the human health piece, we are not healthy in terms of cardiovascular disease and others, the obesity epidemic globally, because of what we are putting into our bodies. Secondly, our land production system is unsustainable from the point of view of expansion of the agricultural frontier, which creates deforestation, biodiversity loss, and released greenhouse gas emissions from that deforestation. But also pollution coming out of the agricultural production process itself in terms of nitrogen pollution, greenhouse gas pollution, methane pollution, and other elements involved in that. So the entire system is rather unsustainable. There's tremendous amount of technological progress ongoing in different parts of the system. We need to support and expand that. That's all the way from lab-grown meat to agroecological farming practices, to hydroponics, to trying to figure out what incentives might promote dietary change in different populations. The system is complex and we need to be innovating on all its margins.
I really like your answer on not prioritizing and creating more silos. I agree that we need to create holistic solutions. These holistic solutions are part of good policies. But in terms of helping innovators, for example, people creating startups, where do you think solutions for certain problems, for example, in food use or rationalizing the resources of the state and allocating smartly in specific sectors, where do you think the innovation gaps should be addressed? Do you feel there is a specific origin area, or would you call for a holistic solution?
Innovation rarely happens at the system level. Private
Exactly.
sector-led innovation will be on very specific problems, and that's great because the skill set required for developing meat alternatives will be very different from the skill set required for innovating on the farm.
Yeah.
To do better farm management that better sequesters carbon in soil, for example. And so it's just very different types of science, very different types of innovation, and we need both. The interface is critical with knowledge flows in both directions, sorely lacking. First, the private sector needs to have some sort from the public sector in terms of where policy is going so that they understand where will the financial incentives and disincentives be, because that dictates the returns to investment on the private side. So if you want to understand how much R&D should be going into a particular thing, you want to understand what the potential market returns to those different innovations are. If the government isn't providing clarity on the regulatory environment around the different parts of the food system over the next 20 or 30 years, that lack of clarity paralyzes the private sector's decision-making process into where to allocate R&D resources. In the other direction, the government's ability to make policy in something as complex as this requires an understanding of the trajectory of the system moving forward, which depends critically on how the private sector is able to innovate, is able to lower costs so that we understand the relative costs of different possible sustainable pathways. Mm-hmm. And if the government doesn't, that information comes from the private sector understands what the likely breakthroughs might be in the next 10 years, what the costs of those technologies might look like. And that should be informing the government's decisions in terms of creating the right regulatory framework, incentivizing the right kinds of technologies, et cetera. That two-way flow of information should be a critical piece to this part of the problem, including how to help entrepreneurs and innovators direct their intellectual and capital resources into R&D.
Absolutely. And I feel that your message is kind of aligned with what Mariana Mazzucato at some point writes of a partnership between the required innovation from the private sector to renovate certain bureaucratic processes within government. But at the end of the day, I remember one of your sentences in class, like, it's very difficult to expect that an agent focused in profit maximization will guarantee uh, reducing inequality, right? So I agree that the government should create this regulatory framework that makes absolutely clarity on where are the incentives, where are the needs. What happens when political systems don't produce the right amount of information on where the priorities are. It feels like this moment is a little bit chaotic because that governmental support is not there. I would like to ask you what to do in this moment. What can we tell to innovators on what priorities should focus or not?
Yeah. First, I would say that innovators can be lobbyists for their own success if what the innovation sector requires is better clarity regarding a stated government goal, then the innovation sector should be pushing for that clarity from government. That's the first thing. And it doesn't mean lobbying in a self-interested way for a single firm. It could be lobbying as a sector to say, look, like we, a group of firms trying to work on innovation in this part of the sustainability space need to better understand what you are thinking with regards to the next 10 or 20 years, because there are lots of things we could be working on and we just need that clarity. That lobbying in large countries can operate at different levels of government, right? Even if the federal government is uninterested in a particular part of the agenda, in a country like the US with so much devolution of power and fiscal decision making, advocating at state government is equally important. A classic example is California, which has helped guide technological innovation in the automotive sector, in the EV sector, by setting goals for itself that then help dictate that innovation trajectory for the country and the rest of the country and for the world. There are many public actors that you can be interfacing with to try to get some of that clarity to inform your own innovation decisions.
Got it. I totally agree with that message of having clarity on the regulation and guiding innovation through the true priorities and the importance of lobbying. Most of the times, lobbying is considered something pernicious, but I guess not necessarily. When government lacks clarity, a little bit of pressure from these groups might be useful. I want to ask you about a different topic. You have worked with geospatial data. Do you feel that geospatial data is neglected at the moment of designing innovative solutions? Governments, including Bogota's, which is my local city, are not using all the potential of geospatial data at the moment of allocating resources or mapping out the priorities. What is your experience working with policymakers and telling them, here is this data, here is the solution? Are they adopting these technologies faster? And what would you be your suggestion for somebody thinking on creating applications and help government foresee needs or requirements?
Absolutely, I think the potential of geospatial data for policymaking is tremendous. But manipulating, interpreting, preparing geospatial data and conducting geospatial analysis requires knowing the tool set and training for it. And the challenge with any new tool with the public sector, of course, is that there are human capital constraints in government that make it difficult for them to tool up. The smaller the jurisdiction, the more severe those constraints become. I have lots of experience analyses and creating tools with and for government, and you run into very common situations where you do all this work with a particular staff person, train a team to work with the tool to inform that department's decision making. Then a few months later, unexpectedly, that staff person gets rotated into another department and that human capital is gone. There's a new person who doesn't know anything about the project, needs to get retooled up, might not have exactly the same priorities. And so things like just rotation of staff, which is very normal in the public sector, makes it very hard to create a sustained technical base for new tools. The same thing will happen with the new ML AI tools as they become more available for government. If it's not served on a silver platter where they don't have to do anything and the results are there for them to make decisions with, if you need any kind of work on their side as users in terms of inputting data, running analyses, or any interpretation of results that's beyond the trivial, then you've got this problem where training becomes a bottleneck to utilization of the tools, and why we have so many tools over the last 30 years that end up sitting on shelves unused.
I totally agree, and government not necessarily always invest in acquiring all these new technologies. Generative AI will reduce the learning curve, make these tools more accessible, and help this not be the constraint to improve processes within government, or are you still a little bit hesitant that that might be a possibility?
I think the potential is tremendous here. To give you a concrete example, right? We are currently working on a early warning system for dengue for multiple countries in the Amazon basin. These machine learning models bring in up-to-date satellite weather data and produced dengue predictions for the next few weeks and tell countries how to allocate human resources and other resources in the public health system to best adapt to the changing disease risk environment, right? Let's say we're producing that tool in English. AI means we could have user-facing sides of that, not only in Spanish and Portuguese with the click of a button, but in multiple indigenous languages for the region that could be put up immediately. Gen AI can do that effortlessly. So that's just one example where you can get a tremendous boost in accessibility of the resource. Before AI, we would have had to hire people to do all that translation, to create all those versions of the tool, and now that's all done effortlessly. So that's just one example where you're getting a tremendous reduction in cost, providing things in the most useful way for users. You could imagine a Gen AI interface in any one of these tools where if the user has any questions, they're talking to a pre-trained Gen AI that can be your FAQ around how to interpret these data, how to make decisions around the data being shown. This helps with the learning curve, helps the user exactly where those pinch points are on the human capital side. Carefully tailored Gen AI tools really help there.
It's interesting. I'm curious to know your design and focus in preventing these catastrophes due to the uncertainty of climate change. In one of your papers that I was impressed on how useful it is to know the environmental conditions that affect our economic and social systems, such as the El Nino Southern Oscillation. That paper impressed me because based on the temperature, certain part of the equator, you can predict whether precipitation will happen in several regions across several countries, which is super important. And then you publish a note in the New York Times asking governments for some sort of celerity and being careful with these variations on precipitation. Do you think the governments listen when you design these preventing systems? Have you seen certain level of responsiveness from them from their side?
Yeah, so I think these early warning systems, which have different tools, the one you're referring to is using the sea surface temperature of the tropical Pacific, which is a wonderful indicator of the state of the planet in terms of the El Nino Southern Oscillation cycle. And 30 years of science has told us which part of the planet will warm and which parts of the planet will have increases or decreases in precipitation. We then extend that to say, does that translate predictably into changes in human nutrition and specifically in the child nutritional status? With 6 or 7 months lead time, we know from the temperature of the tropical Pacific that 7 months later, in certain parts of certain countries, children are likely to fall into undernutrition, and you could proactively assign resources to those places. As a class of tools, there are multiple early warning systems of different kinds. The World Food Program, USAID have used early warning systems on hunger in other contexts. There is usage of these kinds of tools. But our call is to say these tools are getting better, our predictive power is getting better, and yet we're still seeing these predictable human adverse effects. As a global society, we are failing to use these tools to their maximum capacity, proactively getting everything into place so that you don't see these adverse effects on children's health when the world enters this very predictable phase of a climatic state. There is some usage of these tools by some parts of the international system, probably by some governments. Many countries have in their ministries of health some sort of predictive system for health. These are tremendously resource constrained. Governments providing them information is helpful. How much they can actually adapt to use that information when they're so resource constrained is unclear. I think we have a lot more to learn in terms of understanding which kinds of tools are more helpful to developing country national governments and how to communicate that information? How do you communicate uncertainty? How much information is too much information? The information overload means that people with low amounts of training are cognitively disabled by the amount of information you're trying to feed them, and they just switch off. How to design these tools in ways that are of highest use to folks that don't have a training in this kind of thing.
Sounds a lot of innovation opportunities. First, learning how to communicate this data to government for action, convincing venture capitalists to provide resources to these countries with limited institutional or fiscal capacity. I want to ask you a final question regarding that. I've talked to many young people, many peers, and there is some sort of pessimism given the current political situation on reaching the sustainable goals and having a more sustainable future. What would you say to them? You have a trajectory of 20 years, it seems to be based on your output, but following this pessimism and these ups and downs of public opinion. What would you say to them?
I would say don't lose sight of the fact that over the last 20 or 30 years, at a global level, we've made a tremendous amount of progress in terms of poverty reduction. We've lifted billions of people out of poverty over the last few decades. There's been so much technological innovation in the green energy space that now our challenge is the adoption curve. Before, we didn't even have these technologies, or the ones that existed were prohibitively expensive. Now we're at this tremendously exciting place where renewable energy generation is cheaper than fossil fuel energy generation. That's a much more optimistic place to be than we were 15 years ago. And same thing, we didn't have lab-grown meat. We didn't have plant alternative technologies, Impossible and Beyond, and all of these companies trying to generate other things. Technology has moved, and that opens up. And so, yes, history moves in fits and starts. Some governments will be more interested or less interested in different parts of this agenda, but the world is large. Let's work with the actors that are interested in moving this agenda forward. There are many actors around the world, not only national governments, but subnational governments, the private sector, the nonprofit sector. There is so much work to do that regardless of the political situation, there is still much progress to be made at any point in time.
Really happy with this conversation. And I agree with you. There is much more reasons for hope. Technological advancement is making us closer to these goals, and we just need to persist. Thank you so much. Hopefully, we can talk more about these exciting topics.
Anytime. Thanks for the invitation, David.